Welcome, everybody. We're MSL Capita, and I'm Davis Turner, here, the Senior Director at MindSpark Learning, and we're here again to share with you another clinic. So, real quick, for those of you that don't know, MSL Capita is really focused on how to become a better coach for your team, right? Like, we want to focus on not necessarily the X's and O's, but all the other intangibles that we need to get out of our players, out of ourselves to make ourselves a successful program, but also something that's sustainable and scalable in terms of what success looks like for the future generations and next generation of athlete. So as we get started today, we're going to kind of talk a little bit about, the two different pieces of single sport specialization and multi-sport athletes, along with that diversification. But before we get into that, we want to kind of challenge you with this activity. So real quick, you're going to try to turn as many of these circles into recognizable object in 2 minutes. I will start the timer and we'll go from there. Hopefully you guys were able to get something out of that and working on, understanding and how challenging that could be sometimes. So when I ask you these next kind of questions, I want you to think about your role and as a coach, and also what your players might be thinking when we approach these types of things. So were these rules stated clearly? Did anyone assume that the rules were more strict than they were? And if you broke the rules, how did you feel like you were doing it, right? Did you get worried that the circles wouldn't count? Did you worry that, if you connected them or crossed them out or didn't actually fill in all the circles, what would have happened? Did you ever get stuck thinking about anything in terms of what circles are there? Right? What helped you break through if you were able to keep going? Did you guys go for like a theme? Did you recognize any patterns? I know some people did planets. I know some people did athletic balls in terms of tennis balls, basketball, soccer balls, and kind of went along with a theme and were able to fill it that way. Or were all your circles different? Right? We talk about different levels of creativity and different levels of autonomy, and we can talk about that, until we're blue in the face, but at the same time, that's that diversification of thought, that specialization, or that single kind of athlete. Do we only focus on one thing? Is it patterns? Is it something that we can really adapt to? Or is it something that we really challenge ourselves to go out of our way to make sure that it's not just the same thing over and over again? So that's kind of the purpose of that activity. And you can do this with your student athletes, you can do this with your team. And I definitely suggest seeing where they're at and how they really relate to this as well. So as we move forward, again, this is kind of our multi-sport, single sport athlete conversation in our clinic. So as you notice, Deion Sanders and thinking about Bo Jackson and some of those greats that were multi-sport athletes at that professional level, we really have to think about what is best for our student athletes today, right? Is that even feasible today? Is that even feasible to have a pro athlete like the Michael Jordans in the world, like the Bo Jackson, the Deion Sanders, and so on? As much as we want to allow student athletes to do this, as a coach, sometimes you're like, we need to have you focus here. We want you to be on your best or get your most potential out of this athlete as we can for focusing on this sport. But at the same time, is it the best kind of position that we could put our athletes in? One of the questions I do often ask, especially with coaches, especially with college coaches and so on, when we have these conversations, is what is the purpose of sport? And it's not really to have any wrong answers, but it's also to kind of enlighten why we're doing what we're doing. It's also to kind of think about what is the purpose of our coaching? What is the purpose of our mentorship? What is the purpose that we're kind of trying to fulfill in terms of what we're bringing to our student athletes every single day? And I want you to really focus on this and almost reflect on this on a daily basis, almost, and it could be every practice, or it could, present this to your team as well. And I think it's something that we often take for granted because we get into the grind, we get into those daily activities and routines, and we don't really look back. We don't look at the big picture, and we don't really understand, why are we here, right? What are we doing here today? What is the purpose for today? What is the purpose for, our growth? What is the purpose for our success? And so as you look at these words on the screen, I want you to think about, what is your purpose? What is the purpose of sports? And I think when we start putting labels to it, it really drives those kind of connections. It really drives what our philosophy is as a coach really are. And I think as we go through this clinic today, you'll notice some of those things changing, but also some pieces kind of really illuminating to some of the statistics that are out there in terms of single sport or specialization or diversification and so on. And we'll kind of debate those today, but at the same time, we really need to understand what's best for not only ourselves, but for our student athletes and the athletes that we kind of focus on. So 3 statistics that I want you to look at in terms of this topic today, right? I'll let you read them, but I also kind of want to give you that idea of what makes you think. What is something that really stands out to you? When we look at ourselves as coaches and we look at ourselves as parents, we oftentimes overlook the fact that maybe we're not listening to our student athletes. Maybe we're not giving them the agency and the autonomy to do so because we have this kind of, I guess, unbiased or that kind of biased opinion, but that unconscious bias that we're already putting on something, right? We really think you're good at this, so keep doing it, right? Even though they may not want to, we're kind of just alluding to that fact and maybe, slightly not aware of how we're doing it, but our student athletes are picking up on that and our children are picking up on that. And we have to really be intentional with how we approach these conversations, because at the end of the day, it's their life. It's their things that are going to happen, the things that are going to happen to them, and it could change their trajectory. And I think that's what really we want to focus on today, is thinking about how their choices today and your choices today are really affecting their future. And even though we kind of always say it's just one day, it's just this, but some of these decisions and some of these conversations can be a lifetime or can be a life and a game changer for this student athlete or your child. And so when we think about some of these statistics, what are they really used for? And when we think about multi-sport and single sport athlete and specialization, is it the right time? Is it best for them as an athlete to go this route, and why? And being able to identify those points is a key talking point to have with one of your athletes or have with all of your athletes. Sit down. Is this a choice that you want to make? Is this something? What do you do in the off season? What do you do as you train for either this sport or another sport? And is this, your primary sport? Making sure that all those connections relate back to the student athlete and what's good for them and what's best for them. So these statistics I'll continue to present, and there's a few of them that we'll kind of share throughout this session, but I really want you to focus on what resonates. What's something that you didn't know, or something that you've taken away or you've seen that really is kind of relevant to you as well as your student athlete and kind of resonates much more than just a statistic on the screen. So is early sports specialization or diversification the best way to develop young athletes? So I'm not going to give you a direct answer. And I think that's something that at MindSpark and as well as MSL Capita, we're not here to do that. We're not here to tell you what to do. We're here to challenge that mindset. We're here to help you come to the decision on your own and really challenge the way that you're thinking about things, but also give you that unbiased kind of lens of what it takes, what it looks like, and how it goes moving forward either way. So as we kind of look into some of these statistics, and I'll talk about them a little bit at length, as well as the combination of the two, and really where we're headed as a future of sport. But I really want you to think about, again, as you're coaching, what is it that you're saying to your student athletes? What are you saying to your children that may be perceived in one way or one biased way more than the other? So as we look through some of these single sports and specialization pieces, right? Some of the benefits, some of the things that really stick out and stand out is they're going to be that much faster to that 10,000 hour rule, right? We always talk about, or we always hear about what it takes to become an expert, what it takes to master a certain thing. Obviously, when you're playing something for 10 straight years, or when you're competing in a sport for 10 years, chess, driving and racing, or cricket or golf, you're going to get better, right? You're going to understand the little nuances. You're going to understand all the different movements that it takes to become more efficient and beyond just the playing field. So as you look at this 10-year rule, you're just going to be there that much faster. You're just going to be there that much faster than if somebody were to be a multi-sport athlete that wasn't singly focused on those 10,000 hours. because you're not getting as many reps, right? And I think that's the benefit, right? You're able to connect with the sport to really understand those smaller, detailed pieces much quicker and much faster than an athlete that's not solely focused on specialization. The next piece is that earlier peak performance. For sports that are like gymnastics or figure skating, you're going to see that sports like these are more intensive involvement, especially at the international level, even as early as 12 years old, right? So you think about and you see, the gymnastics, especially in the Olympics, the ones that are coming up, and you notice that these young athletes are 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, and now there's rules about it, but at the same time, they're at their peak at these younger ages. So they don't hit that peak in their 20s or 30s. By then, they're too old. So I think when we think about sport specialization, we have to think about which sport. We have to think about what they're training at and where and how they're training and what's best for that specific sport, because you're not going to get a football player ready for the NFL at age 15 or 16. Physically, that maturation level is not there. And so we have to really identify which sports are going to be catered to which and where they're going to benefit most if they're going to specialize at an early age. So the one thing too is that specialization also provides that age group success, right? So in other words, if a baseball player's dream to win a Little League World Series, by all means, committing to baseball at age 6 or 7 is a way to gain success in that age group, right? You're going to work your way into those, high-tiered leagues at an earlier and faster pace than those other student athletes that are not focused necessarily on that sport of baseball or that singular goal of the Little League World Series. And then by focusing on that one sport from a young age, they have access to these elite clubs because they not necessarily have the skills or the talent level, but they have that knowledge, they have that recognition, they have that self-worth and that self-confidence because they know so much more about the game. They know so much more. They've been entrenched in it, as well as who's who in the field. So making sure that they're connected to the right leagues, the right teams, the right organizations to get them to play at that highest level. And if they specialize, they're more apt to know who those players are rather than people that are kind of in and out and being able to do that. So as we think about that singular sport and that specialization, that athletic specialization, we think about all those different elements, but also the feedback that you get. Not only are you going to specialize in this one sport, you're going to get feedback that's directly tied to this one sport, not necessarily you as an athlete, as a person, but specific feedback that's detailed to your athletic ability. What do you need to do to be better at baseball? What do you need to do to be better at football? Whatever it is, you're going to get specific feedback that you can do to enhance that game. When you're talking about a multi-sport athlete, you're going to get feedback for that sport that coach is in, right? But does that necessarily translate directly to another sport? It can in many cases, but not necessarily is it specific to that sport. So being able to adapt and being able to see the benefits of a single sport or that specialization, oftentimes we overlook what could happen, right? We oftentimes overlook the benefits. But at the same time, there are a few drawbacks to specializing in sport. So one of the recent studies out of Ohio State University, a huge lack of a huge kind of increase in adult inactivity for those that specialize early on. Because those that committed to a sport early on, they were often the first to quit, and they suffer that lifetime of consequences because they were the ones that quit. And they were like, well, I focused too early. I tried really hard early on, and now I'm kind of done. I'm over it. And you get burnt out. And I think that's what happens. And you'll see that kind of another note down below is because they focus so much of their attention, there's so much of their identity is focused on that sport. That's why that burnout happens. They're more often to have these overuse injuries. Sorry, not energy. You think about the study that was done out of Loyola University that came to early specialization. One of this was the strongest predictors of injury. And athletes in that study who specialized were 70 to 93% more likely to be injured than children who played multiple sports. That means they're not cross-training their body. They're making sure that those repetitious movements are putting a lot of wear and tear on those joints and on those limbs. A lot of times it's the Osgood-Schlatter's, it's those, knees and elbows and shoulders and wrists, especially with little league elbow and little league shoulder when you think about baseball and softball. And so these injuries, they become more prominent at a younger and earlier stage because of the repetitions that they're not overusing, or they're overusing those muscles comparatively to a multi-sport athlete who has to engage in different muscle groups and different actions and movements through the different sports. We oftentimes see burnout when children specialize, and they're at far greater risk because of that, because of the stress, because of the decreased motivation and lack of enjoyment. And it's because it's repetitious, right? You're not going to enjoy something you have to do over and over and over and over again. And sometimes it's like those mundane days where you're just like, you can't. You have to kind of give up and you just focus on something else because it's too monotonous and it's almost the same stuff. And when we think about this burnout, right, it's not necessarily everyone. It's those student athletes that may not feel fulfilled, right? And I think when we talk about specialization, oftentimes we confuse that with pressurization, and sometimes it's that pressure that we put on ourselves, or we put on our student athletes to make that decision. We put too much pressure on our student athletes to succeed or to fulfill our dreams for them, and they're not living up to their potential if they don't get to this point. And so that puts a lot of stress, that creates a lot of depression and anxiety in these student athletes if we're not careful of how we present this information. If they want to specialize in a sport because they love it, by all means, like that's where we give them that agency and autonomy to do so, right? But we're not the ones that are driving that choice. We're the ones that are sitting back and allowing them to drive that car. But at the same time, taking our hands off the steering wheel, taking our hands off their shoulders when it kind of comes to leaning and pushing back and finding that resistance. It is their choice, and it always has to be their choice. And I think when we think about those Lionel Messis in the world and the people that started off early at a young age and they fell in love with the sport, that's that passion that we want to continue to exude and uplift. And so if we're there to continue pushing and tell them that they're doing something wrong, some people may respond well to it, some people may not. And we have to understand what that line is when it's pushing too much or when we're not pushing enough, and finding that potential. So it is a fine line, but that also goes back to the relationships that we're building with our student athletes and our children, and being able to identify where that breaking point is and where that pushing and that point where they like to be pushed, and so on. And one of these last pieces that I want to focus on too is that these single sport athletes and the specialization often is like this myth, right? We look at the commercialization of these pro athletes now, and oftentimes we don't hear about their background. We only think that they got there because they played this sport to this mastery level at such a young age. But, like the Lionel Messis, they did play that sport, but also you think about the Adam Scotts in the world and the LeBron James, the Kobe Bryants, all these other multi-sport athletes that are famous. We'd never hear about their other backgrounds or the choices that they could have made in terms of other sports or other passions or what they could pursue. So we almost commercialize this and glamorize this one athlete to become what they want to become in this pro level, in this pro sense, when we don't know their story. We don't know where they came from and what they were involved with before, because it's not usually said unless it's, documented and researched, but that's not often brought up in broadcasts or on the everyday kind of talking points. So we think about, what are those drawbacks? What are those benefits? And we have to make those decisions for ourselves, but also for having these conversations with our student athletes as well as our children, and thinking about what's best serving them now. And is it too early to specialize? And by all means, there is that point in that moment where children do want to specialize. It can come early on, it can come later on. It's just depending on that maturation level, and it depends on that development model. If you're doing a long-term athletic development model, I'm full support of those. And I think that's where we have to understand where those benefits come from. So before we get into the next session, I want to hear your thoughts on this conversation, right? I want to hear your thoughts on, put them in the chat. We can share, you can turn your mic on. Please share what you thought about single sport athletes and this kind of specialization piece. Thank you guys. We're gonna have to move on, but those were some great insights, and I really loved the topics of that we covered so far. But we also have to move on to the multi-sport and the diversification. So, thinking about almost the counterintuitive point that we're going to transition to this is this multi-sport athlete and the diversification. One of the key pieces that I find really intriguing is this graph, even though it's almost a hand-drawn graph, but by Urban Meyer. It's to look at the recruits and look at how he recruited for his football team, right? Even at the Ohio State, at the epitome and the pinnacle of college football, up there with Clemson and Alabama and Georgia and all those other SEC schools, as well as the Big Ten, Ohio State has always been one of those top programs. I'm a Michigan fan. I don't want to admit it, but they have been at the top of the game for a while. And as depressing it is for me to say, it rings true. And I have to kind of give props to them. But at the same time, you look at the multi-sport athletes that they have and why they recruited, right? What is it that a multi-sport athlete does, or that diversification in sport? What does it do for an athlete to make them a better athlete? And I think that's when we think about some of these points, is that they experience more long-term success. They don't often have that burnout because of injuries, or they're not disengaged with it because they're able to jump from sport to sport and kind of get that familiarity back down by playing it. There's not an off season where they're just trying to build skill and they just focus on the one sport over and over and again. They're focusing on different skills and different elements that will help them in that game, because they're consistent, right? They're building muscles, they're building they're engaging different parts of their brain, they're engaging different parts of their body, and being active is going to kind of leave them more success in the future in terms of that long-term success, as well as health and fitness level. So this also, multi-sport and diversification also limit that overuse injury. Those injuries that they get when they're repeating those same movements over and over. By playing multiple sports, it gives them time to heal and develop different muscle groups. So those tendons, those ligaments, those shoulders, those arms and elbows that we talk about that get overused, the Tommy John surgery, they're not going to experience as much as those, because they're engaging different groups and allowing those muscles to rest or to move on and just do different movements altogether. So being able to focus on that is huge, especially with that athletic development, because you want a well-rounded athlete, rather than just focusing on what skills, what muscle groups are only beneficial to this sport, right? If you're a multi-sport athlete, you're going to be, you could have the agility of a soccer player, you can be and have the kind of quickness and reaction of a racquetball player, but also if you're playing football, those quick twitch muscles are definitely going to be beneficial for you in the long run anyway. The one thing too we often have is less pressure and less burnout, right? It's a real problem for athletes that do specialize early, but when we get sick of one sport, we start another, right? So that diversification kind of leads you away from those conversations, or leads you away from those, ideas, because you're just entrenched in sports, jumping from one to another. It helps that passion, and it helps kind of create that excitement to be like, oh, well, I'm done with soccer practice, I'm going to jump to hockey, or I'm going to go vice versa, and just be able to jump back and forth. So having those conversations, having those ideas of being able to just continually stay active also promotes that idea of that long-term success. You're going to accumulate a lot more cross-sport skills, right? So this not only enhances your hand-eye coordination, balance, endurance, explosion, communication, athletic agility. Like, you want to experience all those things, right? You want to have your athletes be partnered with an athlete that does that, right? You want your student athletes to have these skills in all sports. So why not give them access to another sport that allows and benefits them in these skills as well? So when you're able to go across sectors and still enhance those skills, but almost take those skills that they developed in one sport and translate them to another, that's just going to allow for that creativity to flourish. That's going to allow for that autonomy and that agency and that self-awareness, their skill level and their understanding of their skill level. That's just going to help them really understand who they are as an athlete by just understanding how every one of those skills translates to the next sport and how it's going to make them better. Personally, I used to play golf, I played hockey, I played soccer, I ran track, I played football for a short while, and all these different things. It all helped me become the person I am today, but also helped me become the athlete I am today. And it helped me in different ways. And I can still say to this day that I still play sports. I still work on these things, but I'm still, always trying to make myself a better person, but athlete as well. And those things continually pushing me to develop those skills. One of those things too is that you're creating smarter and more creative players because they're able to have those decisions and pattern recognition from one sport. They're able to translate those. So those cognitive pieces that not even have to do with the physical skills of it, it's those qualities that coaches at high level teams are often looking for. It's the cognitive awareness and the spatial awareness and where you need to be and how you find patterns and how you kind of decipher and read defenses. That's how you're going to attack, or that's how you're going to read the opposing team. So being able to identify and look at one sport and translate that to another, it's very, very beneficial for coaches, because they can say, all right, well, at this level or at this team, they're going to be able to see this, this, and this, and having those conversations with your athletes, why they made this decision, is going to help them improve as well, because they're able to talk you through that choice that they made. And I think that's one of those conversation pieces that we have or have to have as coaches as well, is why did you make this? It may open up your eyes to why they made that decision. It gives you that empathy, but also builds that relationship and allows them to have more creative, say in their work is in practice as well. One of the cool things too that I put the statistic up there, but below the image, 88% of college athletes surveyed participated more than one sport as a child. That's a huge number, right? We look at some of those statistics earlier. We talk about Olympians too. All these multi-sport athletes find more success later on because of that long-term success, because of that injury prevention and lack of burnout. Right. We oftentimes look at some of those statistics of more than 80% of, student athletes quit before the age of 15. It's terrifying to me as a coach, as well as a person, because you want people to engage in this physical activity, but for their health, but also for the benefits that sports offer beyond, just the academic success, not their athletics, and beyond the athletic success, all those different soft skills and communication skills that go along with it. So to find some of those appalling statistics, like 80% of people dropping out, what are we doing as coaches to help prevent that? What are we doing as people to not allow that to happen and prevent that from happening in the future? And what conversations need to happen that aren't happening? And I think that's what we really need to focus on, because when we think about multi-sport athletes, not only is there great positives, but there's also some negatives that we have to be aware of too, because we often say these coaches often say at the high levels, say they want a multi-sport athlete, but sometimes, like we mentioned earlier, there's just not enough time, or there's not, enough, focus on the enjoyment for this one child. This one child may love rock climbing and that's it. They may love soccer and that's it. And that's okay. Allow that to happen. And if they burn out, if they get too tired of it, we have to step back ourselves and not put our kind of pressure on them as well, because they're already probably filling themselves up with pressure mentally, physically, and emotionally, trying to fulfill what you want for them as well. So one of those things that we talk about as a multi-sport athlete is that lack of time too. And we mentioned this just a second ago, but going a little bit more in depth of this is sometimes schedules overlap, schedules become too demanding, and it's very hard for a child to rest or participate in any other activities. I remember I jumped into, when I was younger, I had a soccer tournament, and once that ended, it was in freezing hail and rain. And as soon as that ended, I jumped in the car and jumped to go to hockey practice. Luckily, at that point in my athletic career, I was young enough, and I did not appreciate my parents enough, but I used them as a chauffeur, and I really appreciate it now. But thinking about all the work that must have had to go into not only logistically planning these different elements, but I didn't even have time to turn off my brain from one sport to the next. I was just sitting in the car warming up from this hail and rainstorm from the soccer tournament to then get, put all this hockey gear on in the next hour to go play in another hockey tournament. So it was a lot. The Midwest had a lot of weird weather, but also it was great to be able to do that, not only for myself, but just for my parents as well, to keep them occupied, obviously, because, being a second child, you always want the attention. One of the other things too that we talk about is the rising costs, right? Is if I didn't have the accessibility that I did with my parents being there supporting me and chauffeuring me from one practice to another, we're lucky enough to have access. We were lucky enough to have a car that was able to get us from place to place. Even signing up for these two sports, right? Hockey is not an easy sport to get into. You have to jump in early, but it's also expensive, and it's not something that we can take for granted as coaches. Is what is the cost, and what are we making our sport, or how are we making our practices, our games more accessible to those who can't necessarily financially always afford it, can't financially always support it, or even not even financially, but what are we doing to lessen the burden for transportation? What are we doing to lessen the burden of hotel stays for some of these elite travel teams, and so on? The list goes on, and why people start dropping out, why these competitive leagues become, so competitive, is because they're trying to gain some sort of edge. They're trying to get, more people involved with the sport, but that also means a lot more sacrifices, and that often comes off as a financial burden, often comes off as, less accessible, because it's so much more competitive, and it's kind of creating the stigma of how elite it is, when it's may not always be what's best for your student athletes or your child. Sometimes the seasons overlap, and that creates that burnout, right? There's no time for rest. There's no time for us to reflect on the sports that we did play, or what season's kind of finishing up, and how do we improve on those. And so it just goes right into the next one. And sometimes it works out well, but sometimes there's that pushback from the student athletes. And I know, as I'm coaching one of my student athletes, I think just last week, I had a conversation. She was just dead tired, right? We have to focus on what happened to the individual in that meantime, coming from one practice going right into the next. We have to take the responsibility, not just to say, hey, you need to step up today. I did not do that. As much as I wanted to push this, this child to say, all right, you committed to this team, and I need you here every day. I need you here to show up 100% every day. Sometimes we need to take a step back and look at the big picture. What's going to benefit them most as an athlete? If I'm pushing them even harder than what they were just doing, and they put on themselves, that could spell, tears for them, not only for injuries, that mental focus, but also that trust in me, right? They're not going to look at me as a coach and say, oh, they have what's in best interest of myself and my health at the forefront of their mind. They just want to perform. They just want to win. And so taking a step back sometimes and seeing what needs to be done to make sure that this child or this student athlete is getting the most that they can out of where they're at today, where they're at tomorrow, and where they're at and looking forward in the future. So thinking about the big picture on a consistent, regular basis, we always have to kind of have that self-reflection, that self-direction, to have those conversations too with our student athletes. One of those other pieces too that we oftentimes overlook with multi-sport athletes is that lack of specialization could limit their potential. And just like this conversation that I had with one of my student athletes last week, I saw it be like, oh, could she be pushing today? Could she be pushing harder? Absolutely. I definitely thought of it. But at the same time, all those other factors that I just mentioned could definitely take it down a notch, could definitely cause and create more injury, could definitely not help her find success, could lose her passion, could cause burnout, and so on. And so it's not worth having those types of pushing or those types of arguments in terms of the health of a child. And I think when we think about specialization, we often say, I want you to show up. And sometimes their expectations for themselves and performing for their coach and their parents often exceed what they think is best for themselves too. So at this stage, and sometimes even beyond that middle school, that high school age group, we have to think about how they're going to get what they want out. How are they going to have those conversations? Do they feel comfortable enough coming to you as a mentor, as a coach, as a leader, and having those conversations with you about, is it time to specialize? Is it time to focus on one sport, or is it good or okay that I continue playing another sport that I'm still passionate about? And I think those are things that we have to really address and focus on. And the one thing that I often do with my student athletes is, if they want to play another sport, what sports were they interested? What sports, could make them better? And I think that's where we focus a lot of our attention in those conversations on. And so when we think about these multi-sport athletes, we think about, all right, it could be something that's completely different, and that's totally okay. But at the same time, what's going to benefit them, and what are muscle groups that are often either interlinked, or what performance and skills are often interlinked within these sports, but what skills can we kind of take and leverage to make them better at this sport or this sport? And so what we looked at is, some traditional sports that complement one another. So things that will help with the development of this person as an athlete while they play this sport. So wrestling and football, both sports require significant upper body strength, maintaining balance, quick lateral movement, and they both, especially in terms of like line play, wrestling and football. You think about the hand-eye coordination and the leverage and the downright brute strength to excel in the game, right? There's a lot of that physical piece to both of these sports that help and leverage and kind of correlate to the improvement of this athlete to benefit in both sports. Basketball and soccer, those passing strategies are nearly identical. Players pass and ball run into open space, the give and go, knowing location of the ball and understanding defensive positioning. Those slide movements are similar and vital for both sports. So just being able to identify kind of pattern recognition, play recognition, and really where your positioning and spatial awareness needs to happen within those. The tennis and racquetball, they're very similar sports in general, but they're both, hand-eye coordination are obvious, but similar footwork and short bursts of speed, both forward, backward is needed, and the nature of that requires like that mental toughness and self-reliance to succeed, right? That's a very individualistic sport. Unless you're playing doubles, you're still focused individually, right? You're still focused on where you need to be and what needs to happen. And this also goes along with a lot of team sports, but more so in the tennis and racquetball fields. Hockey and lacrosse, whether it's shooting a slap shot or just within the blue line or snapping off a crank shot with the man advantage, it takes that similar mastery of hand-eye coordination for both, right? Added the similarities of like surface layout and the importance of face-offs, player-friendly assists, and building up those skills to either kind of sport endurance training, the physical nature of the sport, and being able to move and hit and grind all in the same kind of position is huge in both sports. Volleyball and basketball, not only both sports heavy on jumping and quick cuts, they both require strong ankles and knees. So oftentimes you'll see high tops and knee braces and so on. And that's why, there's a lot of the similar injuries when it comes to, personal trainers and seeing these athletes often. But both need constant communication to be successful. Those lateral movements and quickness are two necessary traits that we look at while blocking, and also looking at like those defensive stances are very, very similar. And so being able to pair these sports together, and sometimes even though school sports are often in the same season that are paired together, we have to think about what club sports are they playing beyond those school leagues or those school times. And I think that they're oftentimes, you can find a club sport that has an off season and ones that like are more primary, you play with the school, or vice versa, right? Which one is more competitive that you're more passionate about, and find out that balance for your student athletes. Another one I kind of mentioned before is when we talk about non-traditional sports, but using them as a complement to traditional sports. And this was kind of part of one of my former clinics, but how do these sports oftentimes help with these more primary or these more focused sports? And I think we oftentimes overlook non-traditional sports as being a multi-sport athlete. So rock climbing, for instance, will definitely help a gymnast because it focuses on that body control, that spatial awareness, that endurance, agility, and balance, and that strength, as well as that mental toughness and mental control. You have to be all of that in both, right? It's very, very, I don't want to say dangerous, but these sports are very extreme in terms of the significance of one misstep could lead to some severe injuries. And that's where, some of that mental toughness really plays in. Surfing is another one. It's one of the hardest sports to learn and master, as well as understanding of how easy it is to jump on and kind of use it as a full body workout, but also that meditative practice in terms of that kind of natural feel that a lot of people get. So surfing oftentimes goes with golf and football, not only for the lower body kind of squats that require in football and the balance that works. Because I know Drew Brees is, I think now 42 or 43, but he used to use surfing as an off-season approach to help his balance and leg work and getting hit by linemen or running away from linemen on a kind of uncontrolled and inconsistent plane. So being able to understand that in that perspective, but also Adam Scott, who is one of the top pros in the PGA right now, also is using surfing as an upper body strength, and the swimming and the mechanisms and going out and catching a wave in terms of jumping up and using your legs is definitely all kind of similar movements to a golf swing and the rotation, but a little bit different in terms of and how it pairs and what's actually a direct correlation of the movements. But using both and leveraging non-traditional sports oftentimes is more significant to the enjoyment of sports. And I think that's where we have to find that balance of what are we doing to promote something else beyond just those traditional sports and just always competing. Dance, yes, there are competitive dances, there are dancers, and there are competitions for it, but sometimes we use it to find balance and coordination and moving several body parts at once and understanding what those benefits are. So leveraging dance for track and field and finding out how it's going to help with maybe badminton or swimming or whatever, that it's great. And I think some of the more talented people in the world use yoga as another practice, and that's very similar in terms of understanding your body, understanding your awareness, and kind of that flexibility too that goes along with dance and yoga and those similarities. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but at the same time, I want you to think about how we're leveraging these conversations, right? It's not necessarily right or wrong, or specialization is key. I think we have to find out, again, what is most important. And each and every case is unique and each situation is different. And so I think when we talk about what specialization means, we're talking about early on, right? Is it going to be, something that when they're mature or when they're kind of their peak performance age is hitting? So gymnastics, figure skating, some of those dance pieces, are those happening at an earlier age and because of their performance? Or are we focused it because that's where we think that our child is going to be best proof? So listen to your athletes, making sure that they know what they want and you're helping them get there, right? Lay out goals. If there's, that long-term athletic development model, where do they fit on that kind of line? What's that fun? What is that fundamental piece that goes along with it? And where are they at maturation, but physically and mentally, emotionally, socially, where can we find what's best working for them? And I think that's what's a big takeaway in terms of this clinic is, what are we doing to kind of take away our bias and take away those kind of words or unintentionally coming across as something negative or something that you need to specialize or you need to be a multi-sport athlete because it's this. We need to remove ourselves from that equation and allow our student athletes at the younger ages to experiment, to play and find out those passions that they have for themselves. But again, specialization is necessary at a given point if they're want to focus on getting to the next level. By all means, that's going to happen. And there's very, very few and oftentimes rare chances that you're going to get a Deion Sanders, a Bo Jackson, a Michael Jordan, some of these world-class athletes that are successful in both sports, right? Or 2 or more sports. Sorry, I shouldn't say both, but that's where we have to think too, is we have to think about how can we still uplift those passions, and maybe it is those off-season training regimens that we can focus on. Maybe Drew Brees was a world-class surfer, we just didn't know about it. And so by finding those types of pieces that we can leverage and uplift for our athletes as well, oftentimes gets them re-engaged, re-energized, and knowing what they're doing is helping themselves. One of the interesting pieces that I've watched, and I've almost completely forgot about it until I was starting to do more research on for this clinic, was this documentary on 30 for 30, ESPN. I think it's 10 years ago now, 2011, which is the Marina Mc Project. Which, if you haven't seen it, it's a wonderful documentary. I strongly suggest it. I think you can find it on YouTube and ESPN. But it's about this student athlete that was this father put him in this almost perfect and controlled environment about becoming the best football player possible from an early stage in life. He was doing stretches in the crib, and from early days on, he was going to the best high schools. He was performing. He was on a diet plan at 5 or 6 years old, and making sure that he was training 4 hours a day. He had all these scientific specialized, honing his psychological, biomechanical, and mental skills throughout his younger ages. So it was a lot, and he made it to the pros, right? He made it to be drafted by the LA Raiders at the time. But what did that cost him beyond? And I don't want to spoil the video or movie for you, but I definitely look at it and see it as kind of like not only a precautionary tale, but what happened to that success? What happens to him, not only in the pros, but at the same time, what did we do to this person, right? What did we do as a society to continue this kind of evolution and commercialize success and what it looks like for some of these athletes? And there's been a lot of cool articles coming out recently on The Athletic and some other websites that allow student athletes and pro athletes to share their voice of what it's like to be a professional athlete and what kind of pieces they go through on a regular basis. So as we move forward, I'm going to skip this trailer because we're kind of running out of time, but at the same time, I want to go through some of these conversation pieces as well. So I put these statistics and some of these pieces up, and this is from a ESPN article not too long ago as well. But look at these, take a moment to reflect, and what do these statistics make you think about? Like, how can we address some of these issues? What is happening, and what can we do as coaches, as mentors, as leaders, as parents, to kind of change some of these elements? And I think as we notice some of these numbers, right, we see a big decline as age goes up, but why? What's happening? And so as we kind of look through and scale some of these next elements, we notice some patterns, right? Like the sport's not fun anymore. What are we doing as coaches to not make it fun? How can we make sports and our practices or our games fun, right? Do we have to limit our yelling? Do we have to limit the competitive level? Where is it that is that breaking point? I mean, we're ranking kids in the world as young as 8 years old. We're, at third grade, people are starting to be ranked against each other internationally, which is, in my mind, mind-boggling. But I think at the same time, as an adult, as a coach, and as a mentor, as a parent even, you'd want to see your kid ranked, but you also don't want to put that pressure on them at a young age, right? You want to be like, oh yeah, my kid's great, or my student athlete's so great, or my team's awesome, and we're, this, and kind of can pat yourself on the back for those accolades. But is that going to be what's best for the child? Or is it something that's more reflective on you as a person, as a leader, that you want to kind of pat yourself on the back for? What's going to be best for them? I understand winning is always important, and it's always good to win, and it's fun to win, but that's not on the primary kind of purpose for younger athletes. They want to have fun. They want to enjoy playing sports with their friends, their team, and being competitive, and also communicating and doing all those things that we did as kids out in the playground, on on the back 40, wherever it was. It was those times that we can take away and really reflect on having the most fun within those sports and those kind of less structured play activities. So bringing that less structured play into our into our daily routines is going to help prevent burnout. It's going to help prevent, quitting and keep player retention, keep student athlete engagement up, and being able to give them that choice and that autonomy to say, yeah, today's not my day. I get it. And you building those relationships and having those relationships with your student athletes only going to leverage that further and where their success is going to come from. So with that, I do want to thank you for joining us today. Again, we have definitely some clinics coming up. So we have something at the end of the month of July here is creating a diverse, equitable, and inclusive vision for sports organizations through social justice. That's a 2-day event. Please join us for that, as well as building culture and embracing pushback to strive for excellence. That's also another 2-day event in August. So please join us for those. You can find those at mindspark.org/clinics. Those are always up, and we'll have some more posted here shortly for coming up for the fall. One of these larger fall sessions that we love to promote is our fall collab. This is going to be for uplifting females in sports and in leadership roles. So we know Title IX really gained a drastic improvement in women's participation, but we showed a huge decline in women in leadership roles and creating coaches and pipelines for not only talent, but pipelines for succession and so on within in coaching roles and in admin roles and leadership roles within sports. So thinking of the Becky Hammonds of the world and the Sue Birds and where they're playing and what's going on with their careers, as well as other sports. And so how can we promote more leadership roles for females? Being a male and being an ally for that, I'm definitely a big proponent. So tell your coaches, your friends, who we think we should best be fit for this and how to create a blueprint for the future generations and moving forward. But again, thank you guys. Please reach out, if you have any questions. My name is Davis Turner, and if you have any questions, please reach out MSL Capita or Davis@mindspark.org. And thank you guys again for joining, and we'll see you guys soon.